Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another top 5 list for Modern going into the month of February of 2023. So, starting out, the deck that's been kind of the de facto best deck in the format for quite some time, and that is Izzet Murktide. Really don't know what else to say about this deck. Continues to perform well. It had a small drop-off when Leyline Binding was printed, and then they banned Yorion, making the 80-card piles obviously unplayable. This deck does fairly well against a fairly decent match spread. Has game against most of the format. Obviously, you have the early pressure of Dragon Rage's Channeler plus Ragavan. You have Ledger Shredder, which I really think was the final missing piece to make this deck virtually unknockoffable as far as the top deck of the format, and then obviously the namesake Murktide. You play efficient cantrips, you play efficient answers. Really the only decks that are typically a problem are decks that can outvalue you, so decks like Elementals, 4-color Omnath. Creativity can be a little bit of a problem with some of their draws, but in general the deck has to outgrind you. There really aren't a ton of decks that can go under it. Decks like Burn and such, which historically have a positive matchup against an Izzet spells-based deck. This deck has enough early interaction for, and obviously with the new, not Mental Misstep, the new Misstep card that's getting printed in the new set of Phyrexia 1, All Will Become One, will also be another card that could potentially even strengthen this deck even further. So there's not much more to say about this deck. Decks like Hammer Time can give it a little bit of fits, especially in the early turns, Urza's Saga, etc. But really there is no one deck that can attack this and expect to do well outside of the Elementals based decks, and even those, Murktide still has a path to victory. Still the best deck in the format, and I wish I had something more interesting to say about it. But really, it's a matter of how many DRCs do you want, how many Ledger Shredders do you want, and are you running 2 or 3 Murktides? And obviously, kind of figuring out what your sideboard options are. Outside of hard targeting this deck, there's really no convenient way to beat it, and hard targeting this deck generally going to leave you pretty open to a bunch of other things, so anyways, onwards and upwards to deck number 2. The deck that's risen to number 2 this month is Hammer Time. Now, Hammer Time is a deck that continues to perform well. You don't see it as much in leagues and such. You generally only see it pop up more in bigger events. As to why this is, I'm not quite sure. Maybe it's the play patterns of the deck. As we've kind of talked about ad nauseum on this channel, this is kind of the amalgamation of a bunch of decks. The old Infect Affinity decks, or old Infect and Affinity decks, and kind of the mono-white Death and Taxes-esque thing with a much more proactive game plan. You obviously have the disruptive elements, things like Esper Sentinel, Giver of Runes, and Blacksmith's Guild, kind of foul up what your opponent's trying to do to your creatures. And then you have this infinite ways to find your hammers, whether it be Stoneforge Mystic, whether it be Steel Shaper's Gift, whether it be Urza's Saga, and obviously 4 copies of Hammer itself. Really hard to not find that part of your combo. The other half, you have obviously 4 copies of Sigarda's Aid, 4 copies of Pure Steel Paladin. Both of them require different patterns to play around. Pure Steel, obviously you get a little bit of value of it when it comes into play and you're able to cast a hammer. Sigarda's Aid makes it difficult to play with your removal and forces you to kind of always respect them having a hammer, even when they don't. The deck has a one-shot kill with Yogmoth, Nexus, and Hammer, and has the ability to grind with things like Stoneforge Mystic, getting Caldera Complete, Nettle Cyst, etc. And, you still have the copies of Urza's Saga. Obviously, the deck's a little bit more vulnerable to grinding than something like Izzet Murktide, but overall, generally has a plan for most matchups. It has a fast clock, has disruption, generally pretty good elements if you're trying to play any type of creature-based deck in the format, and it is number 2 this month. A deck that has risen back to number 3 this month, and that is Golgari Yogmoth. Now, Yogmoth This is a deck that's existed for some amount of time. It doesn't show up a ton in leagues, but it also continues to put up a lot of results in the preliminaries, the challenges, paper events, etc. It is kind of the spiritual successor to a lot of other decks, much like Hammer Time is. It's kind of the spiritual successor to the Heliod combo, the Vizier combo decks, the old Kitchen Finks combo decks, etc. This deck has an infinite combo in it. I believe, if I remember correctly, this version's running Hapatra. That also gives you the ability to create, if not infinite things, allow you to infinitely trigger with Yogmoth, because you always have creatures to thing, and then you have access to Blood Artist, which gives you infinite damage when you're looping your undying creatures, trying to kill your opponent, draw your deck, etc. Obviously, deck is built around the namesake card Yogmoth. You have 4 copies of Yogmoth, 4 copies of Quarter Calling, some number of Eldritch Evolution to be able to go find it. And then, you have Mana Acceleration, Birds of Paradise, Ignoble Hierarch, and Wall of Roots. And then you have the Undying creatures, Strangle Rootgeist, Yogmoth, and obviously some of these versions also play Geralf's Messenger as a one way to loop and kill your opponent. Blood Artist obviously allows you to gain some life when you're sacrificing all these creatures. You also can play copies of Prosperous Innkeeper. I've seen some of these builds. Allows you to kind of loop with life. Otherwise, you can only kill with Yogmoth when you're above your opponent's life total, especially when you were using the Geralf's version of the method. The deck, it's interesting. Obviously, as a combo deck, I'm not as familiar with its strengths and weaknesses because it's been quite some time since I've researched the deck. But, it is a deck that has a reasonable beatdown plan, has an infinite combo, has a grinding plan with Grist. All of those elements you kind of need when you're playing any type of creature-based deck in Modern, because the removal has just gotten so good. Your creatures really need to be resilient and powerful, in addition to having the ability to kill your opponent quickly out of nowhere. And this deck definitely checks all of those boxes as well. Another deck that has popped up more and more and more and more is Underroll Breach midrange. The deck's kind of developed from Underroll Breach Grinding Station, and a lot of them have moved away from the Grinding Breach portion of the thing, or Grinding Station portion of the deck, but they're still playing Underroll Breach as kind of a value card. In a lot of ways, this deck plays out somewhat similarly to Murktide, especially in the early turns. You kind of have this plan of Dragon Rage's Channeler, Ledger Shredder, DRC, pressuring your opponent. You gain some value off your Mishra's Baubles, your Expressive Iterations, etc. Where it differs from Murktide is Underworld Breach is either a 1-kill combo with Lightning Bolt and a bunch of cards in your graveyard, or it is refill your hand with Mishra's Baubles. So you have 10 or 12 cards in your graveyard, you play Underworld Breach, all of a sudden you can Mishra's Bauble like 3 or 4 times, draw basically a new hand, and kind of set up to try to kill your opponent again. The decks play out similarly in the early game. Mid-game, they kind of differ in what they're doing, and obviously this deck playing the Jeskai has a little bit better answers in terms of to specific matchups, like Hallowed Moonlight for creativity, etc. Murktide's still probably the better deck. I know some notable modern content creators like Andre Maguchi think that Breach is just kind of trash. That's a trap, but the deck does continue to put up results, and it does continue to perform well over and over again. And it's kind of hard to bet against a deck that is playing Ragavan, DRC, and Ledger Shredder, also Expressive Iteration, and so, it is a deck you have to know and respect, and a deck that is popping up more and more in these big events as well. Another deck that continues to pop up, which I would probably say is the 5th best deck in the format right now, is all of the creativity variants. Now, it used to be there was this variation where you had, first it was Velomachus creativity, then it was Sarah's Ascendant and, not Sarah's Ascendant, Sarah's Avatar, or whatever, the 7 mana protect your creature from, or protect your everything from a particular thing. I can always forget which one it is. I want to say, taking a look real quick, Sarah's Emissary, I'm sorry, is the card that I was trying to think of. But this deck has basically settled on that Archon's the best win con in the main deck. its value. It's a 1-card thing, doesn't have to connect for damage. It just can grind out value just simply by its ETB triggers and attack triggers. It doesn't even actually have to connect for damage to be a very powerful thing. The rest of the thing is, do you play the Jund variant, which has a little bit better mana, but isn't quite as powerful, or do you play this blue, this Teamer base with a little bit of black in the deck? Do you play all 5 colors and lean into Leyline of Binding? A lot of it comes down to what answers do you want to have access to, what interaction do you want to have access to, and how consistent you want to be able to find your combo. The downside of a deck like this, it's a little bit slow, it's a little bit clunky compared to a lot of the rest of the format. You don't get to play cards as much like Expressive Iteration and stuff. You still have the power combo of Wrenn and 6 and Fairy Time Raveler that a lot of the Omnath decks used to run, or still do run, but have obviously slid down the thing. But, you still get to run Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and all trying to set up Archon of Cruelty. Now, Archon of Cruelty can undo a lot, but if your opponent has an overwhelming board state, sometimes it's not enough, but still is a very powerful creature to be swinging into, or to be, trying to find. The downside with this deck now, people are starting to find ways to hard target it. You're seeing things like Hallowed Moonlight in sideboards. You're seeing things like Orvar, etc. I think as those cards continue to uptick a little bit, a deck that already is fighting a fragile mana base and vulnerabilities to things like Blood Moon tends to slide down a little bit as, people are hard targeting the deck a little bit. And it's still a very powerful deck, probably the best mid-range combo deck in the format, but still not as powerful maybe as it once was about a month or so ago. And, there are a bunch of different variants that you do have to try to figure out when you're playing the deck. Persist, not persist, Leyline Binding, not Leyline Binding, Jund variant, etc. So, lots to figure out with the deck, and, it does give you a lot of flexibility, but also comes at the price of a very, very stretched mana base because you're trying to play basically 5-color mono red. So, and let's do one more honorable mention for the month. So, honorable mention, or deck number 6 for the month, Scam. Scam is basically the best pure mid-range deck left in the format. Omnath is a mid-range deck, sure. Some of these Izzet Breach decks, they're kind of mid-rangey, but the old, Jund tradition mid-range deck, this is the closest thing you've got. And even it has curveballs. You have Ragavan, must answer threat. You have Blood Moon, for a lot of decks, must answer threat, especially if you pair it with Ragavan. And then to pair it all with this, you have the dynamic duo of Grief and Fury, and these various Feign Death, Malakir Rebirth, Undying Malice effects, and just threaten to double Thought Seize your opponent, put a 4/3 in play, or put a 4/4 double striker into play on turn 1, and if your opponent can't answer it, they're dead in 2 or 3 hits. So, deck is powerful, has explosive openings potentially, has the old kind of rock grindy plan with things like Seasoned Pyromancer and Dothy Voidwalker, and hard casting your Griefs and Furies. Obviously, the downside with the deck, if you can get past that explosive opening, it is just kind of a slow, mopey mid-range deck. A lot of decks can beat that. I know as a primarily burn pilot, if I'm staring down this deck and they don't have their busted turn 1 opening, my chances of winning probably went up a good 30-40% in that game. So, it's crazy that opening really matters that much. But in a format like Modern, where the first 2 or 3 turns really dictate mostly how the game's going to go, it's an important thing to note. Obviously, people continue to iterate on this deck, but it's mostly a known quantity at this point. It's probably, I guess Breach is probably the newest of the batch, but it's probably the most iterated on deck of late. A lot of the other decks have been kind of, probably 65 of the 75 cards of those decks have been known quantities for quite some time. It's just a matter of, flushing out your flex spots as to what you want to attack the format with. But deck you should still know and respect, and a deck that, we see pop up every now and again when we're playing on the channel. So, something you should also be aware of. Don't forget, this is your top 5 list for the month of February 2023. Things might get shaken up a little bit with the printing of Phyrexia All Will Be One. I know there's a few cards that people are taking a look at, the most notable being the 1-mana counterspell that counters on anything 1 mana or less, could potentially have an effect on the format. Because if you look at this deck, there's 16 1-drops. You look at Jeskai Breach, there's 22 1-drops plus 4 Mishra's Baubles. You look at Murktide, a lot of the same thing. You look at Creativity, Creativity, don't care. Hammer Time, a whole bunch of their decks 1-drops. Yogmoth, affects them a little bit. But, you know, it's certainly a card that could see some play. Even against random matchups like Green Tron, they have their Stars and Spheres and Ancient Stirrings. So it's a card that could see some play. Obviously, it's not free to play like Mental Misstep was, but still, it is a card that could affect the format, much like Spell Snare does at times. But as always, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know what your top 5 list is.